What's up, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube? Boogie298 coming at you live once again through the power of the internet. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about how we got into such a mess when it comes to the gaming industry and how it's monetized. And what I want to try to do in this video is take a look at the history of gaming and how gaming has been monetized differently over the years and how we got into this particular mess. It's all about the history of separating the gamer from its quarter, or I guess these days from its $10 or even $100 bill. I will say I've researched this a little bit using resources like Wikipedia and a few different articles, but as always, I'm not perfect. And this video is largely anecdotal. This is how I remember things, okay? So if you're inspired by something in this video, fact check it. Just like any other YouTube video, you can't take it as written. You should do your own research based on the stuff you hear in this video. But it all begins with one of these, and this is an arcade machine, and this is the very first wildly popular arcade machine, and it's called Pong. And basically, for plopping a quarter in this thing, you and another player could use this television screen inside of an arcade cabinet to play a video game set to a basic score. And this was meant to be a little amusement machine that you might find in a penny arcade or somewhere where they have pinball machines, but primarily in bars and places like that. And the business model that was used here was fairly simple. Either you as a business owner would purchase a Pong machine for a set amount of money, knowing that you would catch coins through the little coin catcher as people paid to play, in the hopes that you would earn enough money back to pay for the machine, or maybe pay for the machine multiple times over. And generally you would put it in a place where other vending machines were, maybe even soda machines and stuff along the lines, but those little things where kids buy gum and little toys for a quarter, or next to phone machines or pinball machines. But again, it was a fairly useful business model, one that had been used for quite some time, and now video games just fit right into the slot. Now, these types of machines ended up being so popular that they gave birth to plenty of copycats. So there were plenty of companies, a lot of the companies that are alive today that were making arcade machines, some of the classics like Pac-Man and Donkey Kong, which caught national attention. And the idea of an arcade was certainly something that had existed for almost 100 years at that point, but the video game arcade became the new way of doing it. You could go in here and spend a buttload of your quarters to play these games, and people were investing tens of thousands of dollars to fill a room with these machines in the hopes of making their investment back. And while it was pretty great to own an arcade in the late 70s and the early 80s because you were probably making money hand over fist, the real money was being made by the people who made the machines, who wrote the games, who made the boards, who put together the cabinets and sold that because they would sell it at a guaranteed profit. And they were selling thousands and thousands of copies of machines, and they became mega corporations, some of which you still know and love today. But there were plenty of companies that realized with a television in every home and 2 or 3 in some homes, it would probably be fairly easy to bring the arcade experience home. So if you wanted Pong, eventually somebody started putting Pong on home units. And these home units were very expensive, especially for having played only one game. If you adjusted for inflation, they're a lot more expensive than even the Xbox One X is today. But it saved you all those quarters from going to the arcade or to the bar to spend your money. And it was a way for some people to bring home the arcade experience. And people were buying up those single game machines, but eventually machines that played multiple games eventually came along. Probably the most popular of which is the Atari 2600. A lot of people picked up an Atari 2600 and it caused the great boom of video game. And this business model works fairly simply. Atari would make a console. It would play multiple games via a cartridge system. People could license the ability to make cartridges for the system. Atari would sell cartridges that they made themselves as well. And so they would either make licensing fees or they would make money selling cartridges directly to the consumer. And this was a heck of a business model. And it's pretty much the business model we've had ever since. When it comes to home consoles, they make a home console, people license the ability to publish on that console, they get a percentage of the publishing fees, and then of course they make their own first-party games as well. And home video gaming became so popular that a lot of people tried to cash in on it. So you saw a lot of different copycat machines. You even saw Atari publishing multiple machines. At-home PC gaming became a thing at the same time as well. Then you had all of these problems with licensing, people not buying a license to publish on any of these platforms, so the versions of games that they were publishing were absolutely abysmal, and this caused consumer confidence to erode. People just stopped buying video games because there was too many options, it was far too expensive, and the quality of the product was very, very low. I mean, I remember a period of time where you would find machines at the front of stores for 20 bucks on clearance, and you would see cartridges in the dollar bin just begging to be taken away at Kmart, and nobody wanted it. Now, fortunately, coin-op machines continue to get better and continue to get more awesome with better graphics and better experiences, and why there were plenty of exploitive cabinets that attempted to just eat your quarters. For the most part, they there was some pretty good value to be had. You could play a game of Street Fighter 2 for 10 matches before you would lose your quarter. If you got really good at Donkey Kong, you could go to the final kill screen. Same with Pac-Man. Arcade cabinets at the time seemed to be fairly recession-proof, which was a good thing because I think it kept video games alive until Nintendo decided to get in on the home market. And when the NES arrived here in North America, I really think that was the golden era of video games. You got a complete game on a cartridge. There was never any expansions, even though there were sequels, and the games were fairly overpriced, I think, for a lot of families. But for the most part, when you bought a cartridge like Metroid or Legend of Zelda or Super Mario Brothers, you were getting such incredible quality. It was hard to complain about the cost because the value was there. It was definitely there. Some of the best games I ever played were on that system. And during this time, Nintendo really set a standard with their Nintendo Seal of Approval, which said, not only did this person purchase a license fee, but we approved the game before they were allowed to send it out. And not everybody got the Nintendo Seal of Approval, and it still made cartridges for the system. Plenty of bootlegs like there, and people like Tengen, who still produce quality games, but plenty of crappy games as well. And eventually, the Nintendo Seal of Approval really didn't mean much, because late into that console cycle, they would let that stamp appear on some pretty crappy games. But for the most part, the standards were pretty good, and we saw this on the competing consoles of the time, and we really even see that up into just about the late 2000s, 2000 aughts. At the end of the day, though, that was not happening over there on the PC market at the time. When it came to the PC market, it was kind of the wild west of publishing at the time. Anybody that could write that particular programming language could publish on the Commodores, the Apple IIes, the IBMs of the day, and they didn't really have to worry about licensing fees a lot of the times. If there was a popular arcade game they were trying to port, sure, but they didn't have to pay anything to publish on that system as long as they could write the code and could distribute the cartridge or the disc. And because of that, a lot of new business models cropped up there. Obviously, there were plenty of games that you could walk into an EB Games and pick up off of the shelf that were boxed and ready to go and fully licensed and ready to be played. But bootlegging of those games was very, very common. And so a lot of developers came up with a way to combat that. They would either come up with demo discs that they would put out in the wild that would encourage you to buy the original game off of the shelf somewhere, or alternatively, there was also the shareware version of things where you could get a complete game and then opt to pay for the game if you wanted to. That's still one of my favorite business models to this day. I wish they still did that. You know, you could pay for this game if you want to, otherwise here it is for free. For the high-end, expensive games, a lot of the times we saw anti-piracy techniques. One of the things I remember as my least favorite is these little wheels where they would put in a code. They would pop a code up on the screen and tell you to use your wheel to try to find that. Or worse yet, sometimes they would ask you to turn to a certain page in a book and look for a certain word on a certain row. And if you didn't know the answers to those questions, you couldn't progress through the game. Even if you bought it. If you lost the book, you couldn't complete your game. Absolute nightmare. But one of the business models we saw here, a lot of people consider to be exploitive, and I'll explain why, but that was the concept of an expansion pack. And that was really only seen in PC marketing because it was possible, to expand the program once it was installed on your hard drive. You really couldn't do that on a cartridge, so you really didn't see it on the home consoles, but you definitely saw it on home computers. The idea behind an expansion pack is to take an existing game and then program some additional changes to that game and some additional content. And so if a game sold for 50 or 60 bucks, an expansion pack might sell for 20 or 30. And this is something we started seeing a lot in PC gaming. Now, the problem with this is a lot of people complained that when they were finishing the original game, they might release it too early, saving stuff for the expansion pack, or maybe they would even edit stuff out of the original game. And that's definitely something we saw in the case of stuff like Diablo 2. Diablo 2 definitely had source code in the original game for stuff that they later included in an expansion pack. And I think that was probably the first time we ever saw really exploitive practices that I remember when it came to the games I was playing. And this pretty much became the norm when it came to home computing. A lot of games would have expansion packs, and that was great. It wasn't possible to do that on home consoles yet. And so right up until the generation that those consoles were getting connected to the internet, which is the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, at least on a popular basis, you really didn't see very much of that stuff. But boy, did you see it during that console generation. And when it came to expansions, we mostly saw stuff like season passes that would promise some expansions to the game that would come forward. And again, just like with PC gaming, you would see some of this stuff getting chopped out of the original code. But for the most part, They tried to monetize that extra content, get more than that $60 buy-in, especially because they knew the game would eventually go on sale. And for the most part, they were of relatively good quality with a good amount of quantity. But eventually we began to see the rise of these little micro expansions, now known as DLC or downloadable content. Probably the most infamous of which would be for a game called The Elder Scrolls Oblivion, in which they offered you a new skin for horses. They called it horse armor, and if I remember correctly, it was $2 or $3. It was probably, I guess, the first piece of like microtransactions you would see in a video game, just a very, very small piece of downloadable content for a fee. It certainly was one of the most unpopular as well, because that was one of the very first times I ever saw gamers band together to mock business practices in gaming. We'd all been a little bit mad about expansion packs before, but something like this was just utterly ridiculous. Regardless of how ridiculous it was, this stuff sold like hotcakes. Gamers began to eat it up, and for the most part, I think a lot of us were used to big expansions, so we wouldn't mind buying big chunks of DLC, but I guess a lot of the newer generation didn't mind spending just $1.99 or $2.99 for a top hat or a horse armor or that kind of stuff. Regardless, the industry began to shove it down our throats, and this is when they began to first really monetize games after the initial sell. When it came to the smaller pieces of DLC, I was always really frustrated. $2 for a top hat is absurd. But I was used to expansion packs, so when they would come up with season passes and things along that lines, I hated pre-ordering a season pass. But once all of the DLC was out, and if it was created after the game launched, I'm the kind of person that would buy that. And you know what? If you bought that too, I'm not here to judge you. I am scratching my head if you paid $2 for horse armor, though. So just like Blizzard before them, they were cutting off chunks of the video game to sell it to you later. Whereas, Diablo 2 shipped with most of the characters, adding 2 characters in a big expansion that you could buy just once. They would begin to chop up little things, little art assets, little quests, little things, and set them aside. And even worse, sometimes you couldn't even purchase those items past the initial purchase. You had to get them via pre-orders, or even worse, pre-orders at a particular outlet or a particular store. That's when the system began to really fall apart. It was almost impossible during that console generation, especially towards the end, to buy the complete game. It certainly would cost you a fortune if you did, but you also had to get pre-order codes and bonuses and things along that lines. Otherwise, you could never play the complete game. And that's pretty much how it was for that console generation for the Xbox 360, the PlayStation 3, and of course PC gaming as well. When you bought that initial disc for $60, you weren't buying a complete game anymore. You probably had a day one patch to install. You probably had future patches beyond that, but it was also an opportunity for them to upsell you. Top hats and horse armors and costumes and other silly things, and sometimes some quality DLC as well that expanded the game beyond its original scope. Now, at the same time, we saw the rise of games on mobile devices, and also a social media website known as Facebook, where a brand new generation of gamers who'd never very much dabbled in video games or ever bought a dedicated video game device were getting introduced to brand new video games, and with those video games, brand new business practices, some which are just outright exploitive. We saw the rise of games like Farmville, which did definitely exploit the social experience on Facebook quite a bit to get people to play games and play them together, but these games were generally free to play, and this is when we began to see the rise of what we now know as the freemium market. You could play the game for free, and they would try to give you an incentive to purchase things in the game in order to get ahead or to make up for certain experiences that they would purposely put into the game that were unfun, such as an impossible level to beat in Candy Crush, or your crops rotting in Farmville, or things along that lines. They would give you little bypasses to avoid what someone over at King Games once called fun pain. Purposely unfun experiences in an otherwise fun game. Now, while I think it's important to note that this is when it became a part of popular conscience, this is not where the freemium model originated. That stuff actually originated in the 90s, and you saw games like RuneScape and Neopets doing the freemium model thing that allowed you to spend money on the website if you wanted to. We also saw free games that relied on you watching advertisements or setting through advertisements or clicking on ad banners as part of the game way prior to this, but this is definitely what popularized it, both Facebook and iOS. And free-to-play games were very popular. You had games like Angry Birds that started off at like $2.99 for the purchase, and they really didn't have much upsell in them, but a lot of people didn't trust paying $3 for a phone game, but they would definitely play a game for free, and then once they were hooked, they would spend a heck of a lot more than the initial $3. We're talking billions with a B, billions of dollars. Some people spending thousands of dollars on a game that they wouldn't have spent $3 for. And while most people tended to be resistant to these kinds of purchases, playing the game in an unfun way just to continue to play it, they did give rise to what the industry eventually began to call whales. People who would not just stop at $5 or $500 or $5,000, but people who would spend a lot of money. And the industry considered this to be good, which is bizarre because a lot of people who spend that kind of money on a silly mobile game generally have problems, maybe addiction problems, maybe they're too young to understand what they're doing, maybe they don't understand the value of a dollar. I'm sure there are plenty of rich people out there who do spend this money and don't miss that money for a second, but there are also plenty of people working day-to-day jobs who spend way too much money in these games because they are designed to be addictive. And when it came to the idea of missing out on billions of dollars for video games, the folks over there at Microsoft and Sony and the people making PC games and all of the big corporations like EA and Ubisoft, do you think they were going to leave that money on the table? Absolutely not. So when this current console generation launched, a lot of the launch titles had microtransactions built right in. And why there were a ton of games that had this stuff built in, it all came to a head with a video game by the name of Evolve. And Evolve was a relatively kind of niche game that not a lot of people are going to play, but on its launch day, its store had about $60 or $70 worth of additional DLC you could purchase, some for as cheap as $1 or $2, and it was probably what we thought was going to be the end of this because the game died upon arrival. Nobody wanted it. Everyone was upset about it. It was considered to be the worst case scenario. That was only back in 2015, though. It's gotten a lot worse since then. I know it looks like I'm hating on consoles and Facebook quite a bit, but at the end of the day, they're not the ones that really popularized this DLC concept and this microtransaction concept, because realistically, I believe that's the folks over at Valve who created a game called Team Fortress and eventually Team Fortress 2, which went free to play. And when it went to free to play, they monetized it by adding cosmetic items that you can find in little loot crates that you could unlock with a key. And when you unlock those little loot crates, you would get in-game items that were just cosmetic. And it turned out to be wildly popular. People didn't mind so much as long as it wasn't pay to win, and that became the norm. The decree from players was, as long as it's cosmetic only, we will put up with this crap. And you can directly blame games like CSGO and Team Fortress 2 for that becoming the norm. Oh, and there's another free-to-play game. You might not have heard of it. I think it's the most popular video game in the world. What was it called? Oh, yeah, League of Legends. That one also used that skin model, that cosmetics-only model, allowed you to play the game for free as long as you're occasionally willing to support them by spending a few bucks on skins. And boy, did people, because it became the most popular game in the world, getting billions of dollars worth of freemium sales. But these companies were not happy to sell skins. They also wanted to do pay to win. And not only did they want to do pay to win, but they also wanted to do it with consumables. We began to see, in League of Legends even, double XP boosts for periods of time, double IP boosts that would allow you to double the amount of currency you would get in the game. You would see that in iOS, and eventually it began to creep into PC gaming everywhere, and this console generation as well. That's right, even Mortal Kombat X allowed you to spend 99 cents to avoid having to put in a fatality code, and that way you could do an insta-fatality just by hitting a single button. That's right, 3 seconds worth of enjoyment for 99 cents. Wow. Meanwhile, a small company that had just been purchased by Activision, the same folks who were dividing up their games to sell as chunks of DLC later, all the way back in the 90s, came up with a little game called Overwatch. They scrapped a giant MMO that they were working on, reused those assets to create a very popular hero arena shooter, very similar to Team Fortress 2, and decided to take the Team Fortress 2 business model as well and start selling you loot boxes that would have random stuff, sometimes just simple stuff like emotes, but sometimes really awesome stuff like brand new skins for your characters, and this was the only way to get it. Now, Overwatch was not the first video game to do loot boxes. That was certainly someone on iOS, but they did take the whole League of Legends concept and take their unique skins and put them inside loot boxes, and where they were very generous with the number of loot boxes you got early on, you began to grind them out slower and slower later on as you continued to play the game, getting people to spend money on that stuff. And you can never buy the skin you directly wanted either, and you weren't guaranteed a skin when you opened a loot box either. It definitely was a random chance. So there were definitely some low-value items, some high-value items, and this made people very, very excited because it was similar to opening a pack of sports cards or gaming cards or something along that lines, and it popularized it because this was one of the best-selling games of all time. And yes, when I mean best-selling games, not only did they do this loot box model, they sold you the game for $40 on PC, $60 on console, which included some exclusive skins that way. But yeah, they sold it. They sold it. This is one of the first times we saw loot boxes in a game you paid cash for. And this pretty much brings us to where we are today. Every company realized that selling loot boxes was the best way to sell their in-game stuff because it's a blind box system. You don't know what you're going to get. You can shove consumables in there. You can shove pay-to-wins. You can shove skins in there. And that's definitely what we've seen this year, whether it was a game like Shadow of War, which basically sold you consumable items, things that you would either stop using eventually or would be killed during a raid, or the folks over at Battlefront 2 who sold you pay-to-win through these loot box systems, or maybe just someone who's one of the smallest offenders like Overwatch who continues to sell you skins this way. And one of the reasons it's so popular is because we are highly susceptible to this. Anybody who's ever opened a pack of Magic cards or Yu-Gi-Oh cards or Pokemon cards can tell you the whole blind box system really gets you right here and a little bit in here. When you get something good, it's exciting. When you get something bad, it makes you want to buy more. That's why I've been playing Magic for 25 years. I promise you. Not only is the game good, but I love cracking packs. If you watch me on Twitch, you'll know you'll do it. And I know you'll probably do it inside of these video games too. I know I have when it comes to games like Hearthstone. At least it's free to play. But Hearthstone is definitely play to win. Who makes that game again? Oh, that's Blizzard too, huh?